Assalamu alaikum and good day everyone. Today, the topic that was assigned to us and will be presenting to you is entitled The Liabilities. Together with me are Mamalampak Muhammad Anzala, Mandangan Abdul Hakim, yours truly, Sampal Abdul Rauf, and Tabu Asnor. So today's presentation will be presenting to you the intro and recognition of liabilities, the measurement of liabilities, the recognition of liabilities, the provision and its measurement and reimbursement, the contingent liabilities and the contingent assets, and lastly, the application of the recognition and measurement rules. Liabilities. So for today's objectives, first is to state the recognition criteria for liabilities. Second, to state the initial and subsequent measurement of financial liabilities. And lastly, to state the measurement of provisions, contingent liabilities, and contingent assets. So what is liability? Liability, accordingly, it is a present obligation arising from past event, the settlement of which is expected to result in an outflow of resources, embodying economic benefits or service potential. When we say present obligation, or first things first, when we say liabilities, these are present obligation of an entity arising from past transactions or events. So the settlement of which is expected to result in an outflow of resources in which it embodies economic benefits. Now, what is present obligation again? So, liability though is a present obligation of an entity. So, the entity liable should acknowledge its existing obligation to a particular payee, whether the latter is identified or not. Now, an obligation is a duty or responsibility to act or perform in a certain way. This may be legally enforceable as a consequence of a binding contract or statutory requirement. So how about the obligating event? So an obligating event is an event that creates either a legal obligation or a constructive obligation. So a transaction or event that will give rise to a liability should occur first prior to the recognition of an item as a liability. So there should be an occurrence of the transaction in order for the recognition of a specific item to be a liability. Again, so the past event that gave rise to the present obligation is termed as obligating event. Now, accordingly, an obligating event creates a legal or constructive obligation because the entity has no realistic alternative but to settle the obligation. So what is legal obligation and constructive obligation? So legal versus constructive obligation. So legal obligation is an obligation arising from, it could be contract, legislation, or other operations of law. Meanwhile, a constructive obligation is an obligation that results from an entity's actions that create a valid expectation from others that the entity will accept and discharge certain responsibilities, which means that the obligation that is derived from an entity's action where the entity indicated to other parties that it will accept certain responsibilities by reason of established pattern of past practice, published policy, or sufficient current statement. It could also result that the entity has created a valid expectation on the part of other parties that it will charge its responsibilities or those responsibilities. Now that is constructive and legal obligation. Moving on, when is liability recognized? So accordingly, a liability is recognized when all of the following are met. First is the item meets the definition of a liability, which is a present obligation. First, second, arises from a past event. And those are the two that meets the definition of liabilities. And second is, it is probable that an outflow of resources embodying economic benefits will be required to settle the obligation. So what do we mean by this is that there is a probability that an outflow of resources embodying economic benefits will totally result from settlement of the present obligation. And lastly, the obligation has a cost or value that can be measured reliably. So the amount at which the settlement will take place can be measured reliably. So under PFRS 9, financial liabilities are recognized on the statement of financial position when the entity becomes party to the contractual provisions of the instrument. So those are the criteria in recognizing liability. Moving on, we have now the financial liabilities. So what are financial liabilities? There are also non-financial liabilities, but we will discuss first the financial liabilities. So a financial liability is a contractual obligation to deliver cash or another financial asset to another entity. So it only means that it is a contractual obligation to exchange financial assets or financial liabilities with another entity under conditions that are potentially unfavorable to the entity. Another thing is a contract that will or may be settled in the entity's own equity instruments, which could either be derivative or non-derivative instruments. So when we say a contract that will or may be settled in the entity's own equity instruments and is classified as either non-derivative or derivative instruments is, for the non-derivative, it only means that for which the entity is or may be obliged to deliver a variable number of the entity's own equity instruments. And for the part of non-derivative instruments, it is a derivative that will or may be settled other than by the exchange of a fixed amount of cash or another financial assets for a fixed number of the entity's own equity instruments. So what are the examples of financial liabilities? We have here the most common one, the accounts payable, the utilities payable, the accrued interest expense, the bonds payable, the security deposit. There are also the cash dividends payable, the financial lease liability, and so on. So how about the non-financial liabilities? So in this criteria, other liabilities that did not meet the above requirements are considered as non-financial liabilities. So what are the examples of non-financial liabilities? We have here the advances from customers, the unearned rent, the warranty obligations, the income tax payable, the SSS contribution payable, the full health contribution payable, the deferred tax liabilities, the provisions for warranties, and so on. So those are the financial and non-financial liabilities. Moving on. So what is the initial measurement of financial liabilities? Financial liabilities are initially measured at either fair value or fair value minus transaction cost. Except for financial liabilities at fair value through surplus or deficit, which transaction costs are already expensed or expensed. So first things first, what is fair value? When we say fair value, it is the price that would be received to sell an asset or pay to transfer a liability in an orderly transaction between market participants at the measurement date. So for fair value, financial liability is determined through order of priority. Number 1, the quotation from an active market. Number 2, present value of all principal and interest payments. So that is what you mean by fair value. But how about the transaction cost? Transaction costs are incremental costs that are directly attributable to the acquisition, issue, or disposal of a financial instrument. So when we go back, incremental cost means that it's one that would not have been incurred if the entity had not acquired, issued, or disposed of the financial liability. So that is what we mean by incremental cost. So what are the examples are included in the transaction cost? We have here the fees and commission paid to agents, advisors, brokers, and dealers, levies by regulatory agencies and security exchanges, transfer tax, and duties. So those are the measurement in the financial liabilities. It is either fair value or fair value minus transaction cost. Moving on, the next reporter will be discussing to you the recognition of financial liabilities. Thank you. Wassalam.